Welcome back. Now that we've seen how to handle a single input in a form, let's talk about how it works with multiple inputs. So I've made a new component over here. It's called multiple form. I copy and pasted the existing form component, but let's say that our form has more information than a single input, like maybe an input where type is email, and maybe another one where input type is set to password. So we have these other options. Let's also give them a placeholder, which we haven't done yet, but that's not very React specific. And this one will have placeholder password. Okay, so we have 3 inputs now, and I've added it to my app render, imported it. Okay, so this is what we see. And currently, this is the only piece that is at all stateful. And if I want these two to be also managed by React, I want to control them, get those slimy React fingers all over those inputs. It's a little more work, but we could start nice and simple. Username, so we already initialized that in state. Let's set email to be empty at the beginning, and then password will be empty as well. Then we come down here and we do the same thing where each of them gets a value, and the value for email is this.state.email. This one will be value is this.state.password. Now here's where the trouble arises. This input has an onChange set to this.handleChange, and we need to make sure that we're updating the state every time there's a change to this input. But the same needs to happen for this one and this one. So we need to add in an onChange, and we can't just reuse this handleChange. This one is setting username. So are we going to do this.handle, I don't know, email change like that, and then do another one down here for this.handle password change? This means that every time we add a new input, we're going to have to add a new onChange event handler for each one. Well, that's fortunately not the case. I mean, you could do that. Like I can duplicate this, handle email change, and then we just set this.setState email, and then we need to bind again. This is a lot of additional code. And at this point, I should be able to see inside of React DevTools that email as I type is updated as part of multiple form state. So I'm going to type something. Okay, so that one's working. The original username is working. I haven't touched password. I won't waste your time. So we've established this is really not a great approach. If we want to add another input, every additional input is going to require an additional method, and we have to bind it. Fortunately, there's a much better way. But to show it to you, I just want to review some ES 2015 stuff. I don't know if everyone's going to be on the same page, but there's this new, well, it's not new at this point, but new-ish ability to create objects with dynamic keys based off of JS expressions. It's called computed property names. So in the past, we would have an object literal. It's called cat data in my case. If you're not familiar with microchipping in cats and dogs, there's these little unique chips that they implant into like around the neck, I think, on animals, and then they can be scanned to identify the cat. So I'm modeling that here, where a microchip has a really long number. This is what they're scanning, and then it should come up as the name of my cat, Blue Steel. So we have an object, we have another variable called microchip, and we're using microchip as the key, Blue Steel is the value. Well, in ES 2015, what we can do is make our variable microchip and then simply add it in as a property, but we use these array brackets around it. It has nothing to do with an array, but we add those square brackets and set the value to be Blue Steel, and this will compute the name of the property based off of the value of microchip. So if I have my microchip variable, if I just do an object literal, and then inside of there I do microchip is set to Blue Steel. I'm not saving it to a variable, but you can see that it computes the name of the property. The reason this matters is that we can use computed property names to reduce the duplication of all of those onChange handlers. We can write one onChange handler that will update the state depending on its input for every single input in our form. So it could look something like this. Your component extends component, blah, 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 handle change, this.setState, and inside of this.setState, we're using event.target.name, setting it to event.target.value. So this is the new part, event.target.name. So the way this works is that every input on our form has to have a name that matches exactly the name that we used in the state. So let me show you that over here. We're going to update all of this. So I'm going to get rid of my handle email change. I'm going to get rid of it up here. And I'm going to refactor all of these to just use handle change. So they all use one method. It's not going to work right now, but we're going to give all of these inputs a name property. Name equals, and then what is the name that we're using? It needs to be the same name as what we have in the state. So that would be username. And then this one down here, we need to have name equals email because that's what we stored up here. And then finally, name equals password. So what will happen here, inside of handle change, instead of setting it to be username every time, we're going to use event.target.name. So every time handle change is called, there's an event object. Let's say that the email changed. Well, then handle change is going to have a bunch of information about the email input under event.target. So when we do event.target.name, this becomes email. And then this becomes whatever the value is in the form. That's what we had before. But then if it's the password input that changes, then the name is password. And assuming we stored password in the state, spelled the same way, capitalized the same, then this is going to update the state for password. So let's test it out and come over to our form. Open up our React console and go over to multiple form. Look at the state as I start typing. Okay, so this is updating username. The email one is updating email, and the password is updating password. So they are all in sync now. They all are calling the same event handler, but it's behaving differently based off of the name of the input itself. So this is really, really useful. Pretty much anytime I make a form, I just add this method in. It looks the same every time, at least as far as updating the state. If there are other things you need to happen when an input changes, like if you want to do some validations or some CSS styles, you could do it here, but most of the time this method just looks like this. And it exists just so that React and the state are in tune or in sync with whatever is in the input at any moment. And remember, you have to use this name attribute, and it must be spelled the same way as what you're using to store in the state. So if it's email, you need to have email in the state, email as the name. Otherwise, this won't work, and we'll be updating something else in the state that isn't even there.